Visual language is an important part of world building and that process of world building. And what I'm trying to do with every body of work that I'm trying to create is to create these worlds, to invite you into a world and hope that you'll come out the other side challenged, changed, or inspired. What's up with it, y'all? My name is Trevor Wynn. I'm an experiential artist based in Chocolate City, Washington, D.C. And we are in episode 4 of my creative breakdown of my latest series, Niggas in Nature. And yeah, we talking about visual language today. There are plenty of spaces on YouTube where you can go to learn the technical. You can go learn about lenses and frame rates and all sorts of different nuances and things like that are going into the creative process. But where can we go to talk about creative inspiration? So I want to jump in and fill that gap, y'all. I want to talk about the way for us to tell better stories, to create more substantive art, to create bodies of work, because bodies of work mean a lot to me. So let's chop it up. Let's talk that talk. Today, let's get into the visual language of Niggas in Nature. So what is visual language? It's communicating with the things that you see. When you're building a project, you're building a body of work, you're building a website, you're building an identity of something, you're establishing a visual consistency of a feeling, emotions, color spaces, ways to get connected to the thing that you are engaging in. And so this is the sort of connectivity that you're trying to build for people to have a base framework of how to relate to your joint. And so today we're talking about the visual language for Niggas in Nature and the significance of it, why I chose different things that I chose, how that sort of created the framework and the callbacks and the things that I wanted to do to tell a certain story with the visuals that I might not have necessarily been telling sonically or in print. So these are things that we're thinking about. So when I'm talking about Niggas in Nature, it's like, how did I establish and build the visual language for it? For me, when it comes to art, the first two things that I am always kind of holding at my cornerstone is, what do I need to say at number one? And then how do I want people to feel? These are the cornerstone. These are the bases. These are the roots that I spring from when I'm trying to figure out what I'm aiming for and how I make decisions visually, how I make decisions in a project. And so then from that root, I can then build the structure of the project and the visual landscape on top of that and figure out the ways that I want to connect with people. So then when it comes to what do I need to say, one of the core focuses of this era of my art is Black dignity. I wanted us to feel the dignity of seeing these spaces in this country that we were forced to build, that we haven't been able to experience at the same frequency or experience at all for many of us. And what I mean by that is not just the certain parks that we did have a hand in constructing, but also the reality that we built this country, that our labor established this country and made it a world superpower at the speed that it became a world superpower. So then the other part of it is, how do I want people to feel? I wanted folk to feel grounded and rooted, but also feel this sort of tension contrasting in this sort of sound and visual that you're seeing. So like I talked about in the last episode, it's creating something that is a dichotomy, but for some reason it still works. For some reason there's still a harmony in the space of that dualism that's present, right? Obviously my target audience in this was us as niggas, as Black folks. With that, there was just complete messages that I just wanted us to understand. The larger population could still consume this joint. You know, many of y'all are watching this video right now, but for me, it's like, it's talking to my people and then kind of going from the root there. It's like hip hop wasn't necessarily music made for the masses. It's telling particular stories to a particular community and it resonated with other people. And so for me, it's like building out who I want to speak to. And if y'all want to, the rest of y'all want to come in a room, that's cool. But who I wanted to speak to is very, very pointed. My ways in making how I wanted to make or how I wanted folks to feel when I created this is coming from a root of like, yo, to my niggas, like I want y'all to feel this way, this way, this way, and have the nostalgia or have the connectivity to what this ish actually is, and the ways that you might experience that in ways that might look like the way that I'm doing it, or ways that might show up different than the way that I'm doing it. So yeah, I wanted that homeliness. I wanted a familiarity with that. And so even in the visuals, you're seeing the only person pictured for the vast majority of them is me, especially anyone that you can see very, very clearly, because I wanted that sort of familiarity to go through. And also it's a metaphor for our experiences of how many of us that you're seeing, but also it's that reality of, yeah, you are seeing a nigga in nature while we talking about why niggas ain't in nature. So then we got to talk about the aesthetics of like how I made the decisions on different levels of the stuff. So for instance, let's talk about, well, we're going to break this down section by section actually. So section 1, we talking about cinematography. So for me, when it came to cinematography, I knew probably from the beginning that I wanted a film emulative approach. It's a pretty standard thing that comes with my style. It's just a matter of how much of a film emulative approach am I going to go. I guess not necessarily how much, but what type of film emulative approach I'm gonna go, because Super 8 looks very different than Super 16, which looks very different than 35. And when it comes to photos, am I going for 35 or I'm going point and shoot? Like obviously it depends on the 35mm camera that you're using, but it's like there's a different feel that you might get from a point and shoot that is a little bit more unpredictable than when you're dialing in a look from like a rangefinder or something like that. And then is it gonna be something that's like a 4x5 or 6x7 type situation rather? You know, is it gonna be medium format feel is what I'm getting at there. And so it was, how do I hone in on that? And so I ended up going with a Super 16 approach, which I'll talk about in a little bit. But so it was creating that visual kind of film emulative approach. Then from there, it was to create these sorts of looks with tripods, with zooms and post, because I knew I wanted some movement, but I couldn't really establish that sort of movement with gimbal movements because I wasn't gonna bring a gimbal with me. I wanted to keep my setup like pretty light and pretty human. And so I wanted to just have shots that were tripoded and then I could do some sort of movement in post. And then the last piece was this sort of handheld element where it had top handle and a rig around Sony a7S III, and I wanted that human element. I wanted that imperfection. I wanted that relatability that comes from that. Because I think in all of this stuff, I really wanted it to feel connected and relatable and something that you could feel yourself in. Those are the kind of cinematographic approaches for this, but again, there wasn't a preconception of what I was gonna tell and how it was gonna show up. So it was different than storyboarding something and having a direct story and framework that I was gonna tell, which if I had this idea beforehand, there's a lot of decisions that would have been easier when it came to these sorts of visuals, but I wasn't in that space at the time. So it became what it needed to be when I shot it. So number 2, editing. My big editing approach was also to kind of create that sort of feeling of drawing back to legacy. We talked a lot about ancestors. We talked a lot about history. And so I wanted to draw back to the legacies that stand behind me. And so the film burns that I use were actual film scan burns from Happy Editing. Then the frame size was connected to Super 16mm film. So it wasn't typical 16:9, it wasn't 4x5, it wasn't square. This is the size that a Super 16 film would be at 4K. And so I made that stuff in that orientation to be a drawback to that, because I wanted to have a certain level of wideness so I could see a certain scope of what I could see in the frame, but I didn't want it to be like UHD or anything like that. To me, Super 16 made the best sense in creating that sort of drawback feel to that and the handheld naturalness that I was sort of going for there. Then the film emulative look sits in that same space. So the frame size matched the type of visual look that I was going for with 16mm film. So these are all decisions that I'm making to honor the legacy that comes behind visually, while trying to approach this from an emulative standpoint, while also then trying to honor the the legacies that come behind me sonically through actual tellings of history and nuances and those sorts of things. And so all of these sorts of things represent legacy. The whole project is recognizing the past, honoring it, living in the present, and then moving forward and preparing for a greater future. Number 3, we got to talk compositions. Now, this probably could have sat under cinematography, but I just wanted to speak about it a little bit off from that. When it comes to the compositions, I picked the widest lenses that I had available in my personal kit in order to stay basically as close to me as you possibly could, but also show the vastness of these outdoor spaces because there is so much to look at. It would be there. The one time that I was out in nature like this, I had a crop sensor camera and I had a 28 millimeter, and 28 on a crop sensor is it's like a 50. And so it just felt way too close at a lot of times when I wanted to capture certain things at a certain width. If I would have had the money for it, I would have enjoyed to have something a little bit wider than what I had. But I had a 28 millimeter on a full frame sensor on a mirrorless body, so it's even bigger than what a DSLR might experience there. And then a 55 millimeter that I use for portraits and other things like that. But more often than not, I was rocking with the 28. And so it created the feeling that I wanted, and I think it ended up working out pretty well. If I was to go back out and do some more visual work in these sorts of spaces, I would probably have an option of something like a 14 or something like that in my kit. But I think the 28 and the 55 really worked well, and I really love what I got out of this. Also, all this stuff was self-shot, so every visual that you see with me in it, it's still self-shot. And then next up, we got to talk about typography and why I use the typefaces that I use. I established a typeface that connected with me, but also connected with what I was trying to communicate. So I was looking for something that was bold and elegant, but also contrasty, which connected to the story that I was trying to tell within this narrative. So I ended up finding a typeface called Black Mango, and it's variable typeface. So that was helpful in times when I wanted weights that were a little bit in between what other weights might be between like normal or bold or semi-bold, etc. And then the name of it was just perfect because I'm Black, but I'm also a quarter Jamaican. And so Mango just fit perfectly in that. It just felt like the absolute perfect name for a typeface for something I was looking for. And then the other typeface that I used in pair was Craftwork Grotesque Variable. It's also a variable font, variable typeface. So yeah, that joint was, it just really worked well. Already have had a couple of you asking what the typeface was. I'm sure through this series, somebody's gonna ask what the typefaces are. So, you know, I'll comment it every time y'all ask, because I ain't trying to gatekeep nothing. I want y'all to have all the information that you can, and let's build real solid art in this world. And then the color choice for the type was yellow, which is a callback to older film styles. From what my research has shown, is they use yellow because it was so visible, especially when you put like a black stroke around it, because it was so contrasty to most of the visuals that you were gonna see pop up on the screen. And so that's why you see yellow show up in subtitling so much. So it's a callback to that for color. And then also we're talking about contrast again. There's a lot of themes of contrast being important in how I laid this thing out. And then when it comes to stylizing my type, luckily there is a company called Happy Editing that I have, all-time access to their stuff. And they released, in the process of me editing this joint called a grunge stylizer, which created this sort of film grunge glowy appearance that you'll see in older films, because it was really hard in those days to get sharp text because of the way that it had to be, I guess, incorporated onto film, and how they needed those things to show up on rolls of film, and the ways that they're editing those sorts of things in comparison to, for us now, it's just slapping it on digitally. And so it was a callback to that, again, a legacy piece, again, honoring the past and legacies that exist there, and also have that imperfection, that sort of human element. Anybody who's paid attention to my work for a long time, it's like when it comes to the reasons why I like film and why I like the imperfections of it. I think that it's a beautiful metaphor for the world, because I think the world and life is just beautifully imperfect. And so I always try to push into that. So again, pushing that human element forward in the way that I'm making this stuff happen in the ways that I'm making work. Like I said from the jump, when I shot all of this, I had no project in mind. I had no final idea of what this stuff was going to come to be. So this all developed as I sat with the imagery, as I sat with the video footage and processed the journey, and then allowed that process to speak to me. And sometimes that's what the creative work comes to be. You know, I was inspired color-wise and stuff like that from some type templates and stuff like that I'd seen in the past, but the typefaces weren't the same. Layout was similar, but it was building upon those inspirations and then growing from there. And I think my personal experiences and reactions to these spaces that I had and the lack of agenda that I had allowed for the raw and realness of this project, of someone who might be experiencing these spaces for the first time without any sort of agenda in the outdoors might experience these spaces. Now, obviously, there's a caveat of the fact that I have visual training, and so my eye might go to different things than other people's might, but it's how can I experience this in a way that feels authentic and not overplanned and overly contrived, and just sit in the heart of experience. So that's the visual language of Niggas in Nature. Contrast, human, beautifully imperfect, all these themes that I'm trying to display through my imagery and call back into legacy and history and progress forward. So I hope that spoke to y'all. This is episode 4. I'll catch y'all on episode 5, which is talking about the narrative through lines of Niggas in Nature. What am I actually saying through this project? What are we actually saying? And yeah, I'll catch y'all on the next one. Be easy, be safe. Peace.